Hey guys, so we just had a really exciting weekend of the European WCQ where Jess took the event with Rikka, so huge congrats to her. And so as usual, I wanted to take the time to do a tier list by the data for the current best decks using Dueling Book data from YCS, as well as some of the top cut deck information from events such as the European WCQ, the Oceanic Championships, South American WCQ, as well as the North American Remote Duel YCS, all of which happened very recently in the last couple of weeks. So you can always check my older videos to learn how the scores actually calculated. Now, of course, a big thanks to my sponsors as usual. For Yu-Gi-Oh! Supplies, you can find the links and discount codes in the description below. And I also really want to highlight a few individuals in Lampy YGO, TSP YGO, as well as Ivan, who always compile all the regional and YCS and whatever event topping information. So definitely go check them out on Twitter and all their socials. I'll link them down below. And also, if you're interested in meta content like I am, these are also amazing, valuable resources to learn, some of the top decks as well as deck lists. Alright, so we'll just jump right into the tier list for this month. So starting off, we of course have Kashtira. Really, not a big surprise. It's just gotten the most amount of regional tops or any other event tops in general for this format post ban list, since that really weird list where basically Super Heavy Samurai and Pearly just kind of got hit a lot, like 3 weeks of them being meta. But you know what, win percentage wise, 59%, really insane. The fact that at least among all the top cut information that we have available, some decks were not available, but taking up more than a quarter of it is pretty insane. And so, nothing too surprising, and I think Konami probably already knew that it was still going to be the best deck after that ban list, but I think after the WCQs are over, they're going to have to address this deck again. Next, we have sort of more so Spright variants. Like most of them are predominantly Runic twin Spright. There's also like Spright for hire with Runic, and then in rare cases you might have something like Tri-Brigade Spright, which I believe topped the European WCQ just the past weekend. So it's another really strong deck. It's been good for quite some time since Power of the Elements, which at this point is essentially almost a year now that it's been dominating. Essentially, well, maybe not dominating during tier format, but it was at least the second best deck at that time too. So really getting a lot of tops. It's really consistent, and Konami has actually hit this deck repeatedly since it came out, starting with that Ronin Tonin ban. But every time they make these like little consistency hits and not like absolute killer hits. Obviously, Spright Alpha is really big, but at the same time, Spright is very resilient. And when they put starters to 2 in the most recent list, I knew that it was not really going to do too much because it's shown time and time again that little hits, it's able to survive and it's going to continue to be able to do well. So next we have Dragon Link. So this is pretty interesting because the past few formats really it was not in like tier 1 contention at all, right? But at the same time, Dragon Link has always been a really strong deck for quite some time. It's definitely had multiple tier 1 stints in the last few years since, for example, the pandemic period. And now in the recent European WCQ, we've seen a lot of these decks top, and it's, Bestials are really strong right now. And on top of that, for Dragon Link, it's an added bonus because Bestials actually serve as like a core and engine piece, especially something like Lubellion that really gets them a lot of advantage. So it's really strong deck. It does require a good pilot to do it well. It's a very combo heavy deck, and so I think it's really solid and something that you do have to watch out for if you're going to NAWCQ next week like me. And then topping off tier 1, we do have Branded. Now, whether you agree with this or not, I'm pretty indifferent. I think it's still really solid. And we did see that, especially also at regional level, but also WCQ level now, it's definitely gotten a good amount of tops. Now, in terms of conversion rate, maybe it's not as good. I'm sure there's a lot of Branded players out there. But you know what? In the most recent European WCQ, I actually don't think there were that many Branded players in terms of overall decks entered. So I think it's really strong. Of course, Gimmick Lock is still alive. They did ban Expulsion. Yes, that does make Gimmick Lock not as easy, but at the same time, Sanctifier, like, really similar, and it's a lot of decks, unlike something like, let's say, Flunder, a lot of decks are just gonna hard lose to something like Gimmick Puppet Lock, and Super Poly can also be pretty decent, although not every branded list are playing it anymore. And then we're moving on to tier 2. We're going to start with Labrynth. Obviously, it's a very strong deck. If you want to put it in tier 1, I certainly agree with that as well. I mean, we saw how powerful it is, I believe, from German Nats, for example, and it's been topping a good amount of regionals as well as WCQ events, and it's, 56% match win percentage, also pretty solid. And so, especially considering for a back row deck, I think that's quite impressive because, from a historical standpoint, at least in the last few years, I find for back row decks, it's kind of hard for them to maintain at like top level status and do really well. Usually kind of see them go back and forth. But Labrynth's still hanging in there, really strong, and I think it's still a deck that a lot of people are going to fear. Next we have Flunder. It's definitely come up a lot since the last month, and it really is not surprising. I think we've seen, for example, Hanko won the Niagara Regionals with Flunder, and he kind of talked about, how strong this deck can be in a format where, let's say, like, branded Gimmick Lock doesn't matter, Kashtira or Spright if they play Ibly at all, which a lot of them don't, but even if they did, also, again, doesn't affect Flunder. Flunder can play Shifter, and it's just, pretty versatile, and the board it can put up is, like, actually, like, a good combination of, like, monster as well as back row interruptions. And win percentage wise on Dueling Book, for some reason Flunder always does really well. Like, it's almost always like a 60+ % regardless of the format. So it's really impressive. It's been getting a lot of tops lately as well, so definitely this is something that you do have to watch out for in your future events. And then we have Vanquish Soul. So previously, this would have been really categorized as tier 1. I think in the last week or so, it's actually kind of cooled down in terms of tops, but it's still there, and it's definitely like a strong option, right? You can't really sleep on it. But, in terms of like WCQ turnout, I don't think it was really as good as people hoped. I believe there were at least 2 Vanquish Soul tops from the European WCQ, so that's still really good. Obviously, it's kind of an expensive deck because of like the rarity distribution in Wild Survivors, but you know what? It's a really interesting deck. I'm seeing a lot of people be really interested in the playstyle of this deck because of all that tagging out. It's kind of like a little unconventional, in terms of like its end board, right? And I actually recently did a more detailed breakdown of Vanquish Soul in terms of looking through the topping list and also just mapping out what the most common, tech choices are, hand trap staples that are played in Vanquish Soul. So if you're certainly interested in either playing or trying to go up against this deck, I highly recommend you can check that video out as well. So next we have the one and only Rikka, which of course won that WCQ event at Europe, as I mentioned earlier, thanks to Jess. So big congrats to her again. So really strong deck. I think coming into this event, actually I was doing that meta-analysis of the top ranked players just before this weekend, and I was saying that Flunder and Rikka were like really strong key contenders. And of course Rikka, win percentage wise 58% on Dueling Book. It always does well on Dueling Book too. It's like really strong. And so WCQ wise, it definitely was not a fluke because you were seeing a good amount of regional tops here, but in terms of other WCQ events, it also topped a decent amount as well. So really solid in terms of its end board. The Con is like really strong. It really reminds you of like the Lair Infernoid days where you just like tribute your opponent's monsters for cost. They have a really good, a combination of, like monster interruptions as well as like their back row is pretty solid too. So unfortunately it can kind of hard lose to like Floodgates from what I have heard, but you know what, if you saw that top 4 feature, that Harpy Feather Duster came pretty clutch. Next we have Pearly. So I think this deck was initially kind of slept on quite a bit almost after that ban list, but you know what, still hanging in there, and you've seen this deck top at WCQ events as well as I believe the North American Remote YCS. I think it made top 4, I could be wrong, but you know what, while it may not be able to make Noir that often, I think a lot of builds are also going second and they can do really well. But I believe the one that topped the Remote YCS was actually a going first version, so I guess there's both options to play, so it can have, at least it has a versatile game still, and being able to like turbo out Zeus is always kind of nice. So I think it's definitely, don't sleep on it yet. I find all the cards look like the same to me. I always have a hard time remembering which card does which, but definitely need to study that better myself as I prepare for the event this weekend. And then we have Sky Striker. So yes, it did top the North American Remote Duel YCS. Dylan Fricker, who's I've known for quite some time actually, well before I started YouTube really. So you can certainly go check out that deck profile on my channel. Although at the same time, in terms of whether it's really tier 2, I'm not really sure about that. It was scored that way though, because usually on Dueling Book, it's just a very fan favorite deck, so it gets seen a lot of play, right? And you actually saw this in YG Omega data as well that I did of my meta analysis video recently. So you know what, it's there for now, but in realistic scenario, I think it's probably more so Rogue. Well, speaking of Rogue, we do have Mathmech, which honestly is actually could be arguably tier 2 still. I think despite that circular limit, it's still finding ways to be able to play and do well. Of course, for example, it did have in the North American Remote Duel YCS, this is the deck that came second. I believe that one was more so like Ignister mixed with Mathmech though. But at the same time, for example, even in regional level, like let's say on my channel, I did a deck profile with Lucas who finished 3rd place with Mathmech. So it's still really solid. And you know what, cost-wise, it's pretty cost-efficient deck as well. So it's still solid. Win percentage-wise on Dueling Book, it's always had a really high win percentage. And it's a deck that can really OTK easily as well, thanks to access code Togger and update genre. I know there's a lot of on stuff on Twitter in terms of like whether those cards should be banned, but I'm not too sure about that. At the same time, I think this deck, regardless, really fun to play and really strong potential. Next we have Sword Soul. So this one's kind of interesting because usually it's like in that tier 2 category for the most part. It was their last format, it was their this format. This is kind of like a deck that's like as consistent as it can get and really solid. I mean, for example, it did have at least one top WCQ level that we are aware of. I believe it was the South American event, and also in Toronto Regionals. Actually, it did win the whole event, which was the first weekend when that new ban list came into effect. So you can certainly check that deck profile on my channel as well. So you know what, it's still a solid deck in terms of end board though. You know, I think it's got a good combination of monster and backward interruptions as well. But of course, there are so many good decks right now that it's kind of hard to choose, and I can kind of see why this deck has fallen off a little bit. And then we have Tearlaments. Unfortunately, from the WCQ like top standpoint, I believe it actually topped the North American Remote Duel YCS. That's where this top's coming from. So you know what? I still think this deck is quite solid. Obviously, now with the rise of Flunder again, and then you also already have Kashtira, and like, you know, Dimension Shifter is obviously a killer against this strategy, which really relies on the Grieve. But other than that, I think it has like, it's pretty solid. It's really strong. I mean, its end board, I think is nothing to laugh at if it's, as long as you're not under Shifter. So certainly don't sleep on it. But yeah, right now I think it's not as good as it was last one. Now that we have kind of like rise of Shifter decks again. So then we have Heroes, which is kind of funny because basically the reason it gets sort of categorized at least kind of this high is because it always sees a lot of online play on Dueling Book, and I'm sure other online platforms as well, because it is a fan favorite deck. It always gets support, and you know what, especially to some of the newer players too, it's certainly attractive because it's like an anime classic deck. Don't get me wrong, it's definitely a really good deck still, but you know what, in terms of WCQ level events, unfortunately it did not have any tops. I mean, who knows, maybe there will be one in the North American World Championship qualifier that I'll be going to this weekend, and I'm certainly going with a close friend who is playing Hero. And so you know what, in terms of its end board though, usually something like Dark Law is always killer against most strategies, right? Obviously Kashtira kind of do the same thing but better, but you know what, regardless, I can't really sleep on them. But yes, in terms of score wise, I do think it's a little high compared to some of the decks that you're going to see after the Hero. Next we have Trap Tricks, which of course is a really good rogue option, and it's certainly, you know, the hype has gone down since the structure deck release, so online it doesn't see as much play, but still, and also it does attract a lot of new players because this is probably one of the decks that they're going to start playing in terms of real life play. WCQ level tops, it did top the South American WCQ event, so you know what, the potential is still there competitively, and so all you Trap Tricks lovers, you know, don't give up yet. I think there's still hope for this deck right now. So next we have Vanadium, which, you know, it's interesting with this deck because I believe, you know, when the ban list came into effect that first weekend of regional level events, I believe it had a few tops actually, including top 4 in Toronto with Max. But interestingly, I think since then it's actually cooled off quite a bit, and especially at WCQ kind of level event the last couple of weekends. I believe the only top came from, I think, the Oceanic one. I could be wrong. But you know what, win percentage wise, 55%. It's pretty solid. It's another kind of like combo synchro heavy strategy, and of course there's just a lot of good decks right now, so I think it's just one of many, and that's why it's probably not categorized too high. I believe it is better than Hero though, not gonna lie, but again, you know, something like Hero, it does see a lot of play online, whereas Vanadium clearly isn't seeing too much, at least right now. And then we have Exorcister, which is very interesting because it actually won the entire event at the North American Remote YCS, and that was Steven Santoli, fellow Canadian. I did also do a deck profile with him that you can check out, and he's actually been on a tear. He has a lot of premier event tops, a really good player, and so I think it was really interesting that he chose to play this deck. It's another shifter kind of based strategy, which can do well against, you know, a lot of decks that's not something like, for example, Kashtira. But you know what, 55% win percentage is also really solid, especially for a rogue deck, and I'm really curious to see if this is going to also do well at the North American WCQ, because I don't think at the other WCQ events, I don't believe it topped, unfortunately, but who knows, maybe that'll change. So next we have Dark World, which I'm almost a little surprised that it's still seeing a decent amount of play on Dueling Book. Now, don't get me wrong, arguably, you know, last format was worse for Dark World just because pretty much every deck was main decking Droll because of Super Heavy Samurai as well as Pearly. But now with that new ban list, those decks are not tier 1 anymore. But at the same time, so while Droll may not be in the main deck anymore and perhaps in the side or maybe not at all, you do have a rise in decks like, again, you know, like Flunder. You know, Shifter is also still pretty deadly against a deck that kind of needs a Grave. And so I think it's still there. No WCQ level event tops, unfortunately. I'm not even sure if there were actually any regional level event tops with this deck so far in this new format, but who knows, perhaps someone can be the savior and at least get a top soon. And then finally, onto the last tier, we unfortunately have Marincess scored this low. I do think it's actually a very, very good strategy and definitely belongs at least in the rogue level, but unfortunately it just does not see that much play on Dueling Book. But at the same time, speaking of Dueling Book and Marincess, I did do a deck profile with King Haynes, who is high rated on Dueling Book with Marincess, so you can certainly go check that out. I believe Herman Hansen actually also piloted this for the European WCQ, so clearly there's really strong potential with this deck in the current format. 56% match win percentage among all players with this deck is also very impressive, so definitely a solid rogue option that you can consider. And finally, we have Punk, which I guess it technically represents more so Gold Pride Punk, as that's sort of like what you see nowadays. In terms of WCQ level event tops, unfortunately no tops that we're aware of, but although at the regional level, I know at least pure Gold Pride actually top 8 Niagara Regional, so congrats to Andrew on that one. So, you know what, I think it's obviously a solid deck, but definitely the popularity has fallen off the last couple of months. At one point, this was like a really popular rogue choice, and as I mentioned earlier, there's just a lot of good decks out right now, and there's just a lot of options to choose from, so I can see why this one just did not see as much play and kind of fallen off. A lot of people like to try out new things and such, so it's not too surprising, but you know what, the potential for this deck is there as well. Alright, so that was it for the tier list by the data for this month. Hopefully you found that interesting, and certainly let me know how you thought the tier score calculation turned out for this month. So big thanks for all of you for watching, a big thanks to my patrons as usual for the continued support, and for those of you going to the North American WCQ this weekend, hope to see a lot of you there. So take care, guys.